Hello everyone, I'm Jeff Van Groningen, Managing Director of the Sydney Kings. I'm sorry I can't be at RecTech18 tonight. I'm actually on a plane to Las Vegas for the NBA Summer League. Wish I could be there tonight. Have a great night. I think the opportunity to come to the Kings and take on that role was all about the challenge. You're actually coming into a situation that you have a desire to help turn around. It is about the challenge at that stage. We were coming off a poor period of time, but it was time to try to make the Sydney Kings relevant in the Sydney sporting market, and that challenge motivated me, so that was why I took it on. Well, ironically, my time at the Tigers and the Bullets at different stages of those periods of time were very successful eras, but they didn't start off that way at each of those teams. In Brisbane, I distinctly remember we were also coming off as a franchise, I think the worst ever finish that they'd had. And one of the funny things that occurred was it was only after game one and I had just come. They hadn't been good for a very long time. I'd been there 5 minutes. And I remember someone coming up to me after the game, pointing the finger right at me and saying, things were never this bad until you came. And that's a really good lesson because, when there had been something that had really filtered through that organisation culturally that was pretty poor, people were in a negative state of mind. So in terms of drawing on those experiences from Brisbane and to a lesser extent Melbourne that had a few challenges, it was really about using those shared experiences of those times to realise you can turn things around, you can actually right the ship. And I drew upon those periods to give me a little bit of faith that it could be done again. Well, in our industry, the way we acquire talent is pretty sophisticated. We work with an array of people throughout the world that have scouting services that we can draw upon. In our particular case, I head up our recruiting and I sign off on every recruit. In many cases, I do the recruiting myself. In some cases, the coaches are heavily involved in the recruiting process. But whatever the case, it's actually a drawing upon of a number of resources, scouting services, vision that we get online sent to us by agents, vision sent to us by other leagues that we request. It's reviewing, it's researching, it's educating yourself about these particular players, what they're capable of, and then trying to take a look at that and project that into how that might translate into your own league. Some players are what we call Euro-style players. They look like they'll actually fit better in Greece or Italy. Doesn't mean they're not a good player. Just means they may not work quite as well here. And NBA, I think, is an interesting one too, because everyone assumes if a player's made the NBA that they'll work here. But if they're a 12th man on an NBA team, getting paid far more than they could here, but have never played there, they're just a bench sitter that really just plays a role. We can't expect them to come over here and necessarily dominate on the floor, even though they have made an NBA career out of being a role player. So it's horses for courses, and we need to really work out, what that player is capable of doing in our league. Well, I think it was a huge win for the organisation, and it was a huge win for the league because to have someone of his gravitas, presence, name, the brand, all of those things, and to bring that into the Sydney Kings was definitely a win for the organisation. It is a victory that is really about turning around the perception of basketball, adding to what I think was already happening with the game, which was a growth, and understanding that the league is really, really good. I think what Bogut's presence at the Sydney Kings within the NBL does is enhance that reputation now and build on that reputation. It is satisfying that we were able to pull off that recruitment. It's a full credit to the ownership to dig in and say, yes, we want to do this. It's also a massive credit to Andrew Bogut that he wanted to take on this challenge at this particular point in his career, because he actually had the option to continue in other parts of the world, including the NBA. He could still find a role in the NBA now. So it was a very satisfying recruitment. I got into a hotel at Melbourne for 5 nights straight. I didn't leave. I parked out there and had numerous meetings with Andrew and basically dug in, and we got through an enormous pile of work in about it was really less than 5 days, about 4 days. Some of those were face-to-face conversations, many of them were phone conversations, many of them were conference calls involving our owner and myself and Andrew at the one time. But I think the process is a difficult one to summarise because it was quite comprehensive. And it was put to me the other day that it seemed a very smooth process. Well, there's a difference between quick and smooth. It was quick, but there was a lot going on during those days. There wasn't a lot of sleep for either of us, and it was a power of work. But it was a rewarding process because the desire of the two parties was to get a deal done. And I felt like from the time that I met him first and shook hands at the end of about a 90-minute meeting, our desire was to push forward. So that was our unofficial heads of agreement to say, right, we've agreed that we want to make it happen. Now it's the devil in the detail, let's get through it, and both parties got through that over the next 4 days. Absolutely. He had a concurrent opportunity come to him from China while we were in the middle of the negotiations. And the thing that I most lost sleep over was that if he wanted to shift back to what we talked about earlier, if he wanted to shift back to just being a financial play, fee for service as a basketballer, we would lose that opportunity with Andrew. Because if it was a fee for service scenario, we weren't going to come in first. If it was a scenario that involved far more, and if his understanding of our vision became shared and he started to share that vision of what the Sydney Kings could look like with his involvement as an owner as well down the line, then I felt like we were in really good shape. So that's the way it went for him. He really grabbed that side of it and decided that that was a difference maker in his mind. But he had opportunities even while we were negotiating to take on other jobs. In the case of Andrew Bogut, our sales pitch was about him having an overall involvement at the Kings, which, as we've put on the record before, actually involves a vested interest in owning the business. So after 2 years of playing here, he actually has the right to step into a 10% stake of the Sydney Kings with a further right to invest his own money for a greater portion of the club, right up to about half of the stake in the Kings. So I think when you shift the landscape a bit and say, this isn't really just about offering a player a contract, it's about offering a player an involvement, something that perhaps he's never really thought about before or had the opportunity. You can't do that in the NBA. You can't be a player that owns an NBA team while you're playing. So this was a unique one. We had to shift the parameters a bit, but if it was a straight money play and just about the salary for playing the game of basketball, the recruitment wouldn't have worked. I think the first big name is always the toughest to get. There are other Australian players in the NBA that now would look at this and say, well, maybe that is a path that I could take later. And specifically, maybe that path of becoming invested in the team is something that would make sense enough for me to maybe forgo the last 2 or 3 years of what could have been a continuing NBA career or could have been a continuing career in China. Once something happens along these lines, it is easier to replicate it to some degree. So I think it'll open the doors to other somewhat similar scenarios happening. Certainly hope so, because it would be very good for our league. The attention to detail in terms of what's important to the person you're recruiting. Andrew was very good because he's some people say outspoken, I say well-spoken. He is definitive in what's important to him and his family. He's definitive about the level of professionalism that he expects an organisation to have, that he wants to buy into. And so I think listening to what was important for him is perhaps a lesson that we can all learn, and I can learn for future recruitments, because it's not just about you coming to them and saying, why don't you join us? We've got all these great things going for us. When you get to a seriously talented individual like Andrew Bogut, you have to work out what's important to him and make sure the two things match up. So I just think the listening element is something that we can always learn. I can certainly always take that lesson for the future, because I think the ability to find out, what someone else is thinking is pretty key when it comes to recruiting. When it comes to recruitment of, say, American imports, we often send a platform which is not unlike a sales deck over to those players and say, look, here's what our game night looks like. Here's what we do on game night. It's an NBA-style game night. There's the big, super cluster screen in play. Here's our arena. It holds 10,000 people the way we've got it set up. Can hold 20,000 if you come and help us fill it. Those type of things are done with the use of technology, whether it's a glorified PowerPoint presentation, whether it's edited vision, where we can actually splice it up and show highlights of what we're already doing. We've even done things where we photoshopped our uniforms onto them and actually begun sales decks with them in a King's uniform, so it looks like they're already here. A little bit presumptuous, but good fun, and most of them really react well to that. It shows a level of professionalism. So I think maybe in recruiting terms, that's probably the main way that we would use recruiting. Of course, the day-to-day things you take for granted in communication are constant in our recruitment game. I'm dealing with time zones in China, Europe, the United States, the Pacific, because there's New Zealanders we're interested in. So WhatsApp, Viber, those technologies are often used. It's a common platform that no matter what area code you're on, you can get in and do that in a way that sometimes your phone lets you down a bit on. Maybe you're not on the right plan, or they're not. A lot of these guys in the States can't even take a call from overseas because they've got such restricted cell phone use, but they're always on WhatsApp, they're always on Facebook Messenger and things. So they're not stunning, probably, technology in your game, but they're just there and they're used, and it's just part of the conversation now. October 13th, we hope that you're all there. We'll be pushing to try to break an attendance record in the City of Sydney. 11,005 has been our biggest yet, and we'd like to think we'll eclipse that with Andrew Bogut stepping out for the first time. So we hope that all of you there tonight, and all your families, and bring a couple thousand of your closest friends, and get in here and see if we can get 20,000 there on October the 13th.